GDP growth for the fourth quarter of 2024 was, I believe, 2.4%. What we're anxiously waiting for is what are the GDP numbers for the first quarter of 2025. Opinions vary widely with regard to, what those numbers will be. Real wages are going up because inflation is down significantly. In fact, inflation declined a little bit in March as compared to February. Not that it's not an issue, but it's down significantly from what it has been. But I think the whole thing really comes down to two things. Number one, this trade situation. We need to get this resolved sooner rather than later. Nobody's a winner in a trade war. The uncertainty creates more volatility in the markets. It also reduces the willingness of business to invest because they're unsure how things are going to fall out. So I think resolving these trade issues as quickly as possible is important. And the second issue, and you're not going to be surprised that I say this, is we got to put our finances in order. And the fact of the matter is that the Senate bill that has passed the House, the budget framework as a way to get negotiations going for the budget reconciliation process is irresponsible and unacceptable. It makes things worse as compared to current law rather than better. And it's time that we recognize the reality that we're living beyond our means, and we need to start taking steps to be able to reduce our deficits and stabilize our debt to GDP at a reasonable, sustainable level. So, those are the two big issues. And, the Fed, you can complain about the Fed all you want, but the biggest problem is the Congress. The Congress has been totally irresponsible with regard to fiscal policy. The last time we passed all of our appropriations bills on time was 1996. They've only done it 4 times in my lifetime. That's an F minus. And by the way, that's the only express and enumerated responsibility in the Constitution for the Congress to do every year. And they've done it 4 times in 73 years.
Well, I'm sure are views that Chuck Schumer's support of the of that bill that you referred to just a minute ago, much to the chagrin of Democrats, I'm sure. But I think just in relation to that China situation, look, it's a big economy, and one of the issues with that massive amount of debt that they're holding is, and I've been saying this for many years now, it's really unfair, I think, of the United States and other countries like Australia to be constantly purchasing Chinese-made goods, and they're not selling them anything. So all they get stuck with is our money, but they can't spend it. And so what they then do is they buy up our debt. But eventually, the roosters have to come home to roost, so to speak. So it is a problem. I think China does need to increase its trade routes around the world. And we are all Western countries are going to suffer if we don't get our debt under control. And the most notable one, of course, is the United States with that massive, massive debt to GDP level that it has, and the unfunded liabilities that we've talked about on previous shows.
Well, as you know, Shaquille, Japan's actually worse than us, but there's a difference. The Japanese save, and most of their debt is owned by their own citizens. The U.S. does not save to the extent we're big consumers. About 70% of our economy is based on consumption. And one of the things that also has to happen is that Chinese consumption needs to increase. That's another thing that needs to happen.
Yeah, but that's my point. The Chinese try to increase their consumption, but we won't sell them anything. Like, just take Australia, for example. We've been so hesitant to sell them anything, and then we complain when they say, well, look, we want your dairy products, so if you're not going to sell it to us, we'll use the money that we've got and buy farms in Australia. And then, of course, Australians say, well, look, the Chinese are buying everything. You can't have it both ways. So it is really important. Now, I do think it's worth noting that some of Trump's trade wars is about trying to balance those trade deficits and trying to make sure that, hey, if you're tariffing us and we're not tariffing you, that's not necessarily fair. Look, I understand that, but that's an argument perhaps you can have with countries like Australia. You can't really have that argument with countries like China because the US taxes completely differently to the way that China does. And in relation to Europe, the major issue with Europe not purchasing enough from China, as I'm sure from the United States, as I'm sure Nick will attest, is that a lot of US made products don't conform to European safety standards, right? And the Europeans, just like the Australians, have been saying to America for years. I mean, I've been saying it for such a long period of time. We love American cars. Sell them to us. Can you just make a couple of changes? But the factories refuse to do it when it comes to food production. There's a heap of American foods which are really popular outside of the United States, but because they won't make some very small changes, it doesn't apply with health and safety standards in other countries. And so that's why, or that's part of the reason why there's a trade deficit that happens. And I think that's being ignored when it just comes to an issue about tariffs.
Well, let's talk just for a second about something that's been in the news lately, and that is automobiles, cars. Okay, you know, the European Union charges a higher tariff on U.S. automobile imports than we do of European imports. But you know, and you could say, okay, if you're going to charge us 10%, we're going to charge you 10%. That's not what's being proposed, by the way. But you know, you could say that. But let me tell you, if you look in my garage, I have 2 European and 1 Japanese car. I've owned American cars in the past, and I'll probably own them again in the future. But the truth is, I think that you know, some countries do better at producing certain things than others, and I think my personal view is the Germans and the Japanese do a better job with regard to producing cars. The Americans do the best job in producing trucks and SUVs. But then again, if you actually look at the streets in Japan, and if you look at the streets in many European cities, they're too big.
Yeah, but then why aren't you selling those SUVs to countries like Australia? We're a big, expansive country. I mean, that's the point that I'm making. There's so many markets, and America just will not do simple things like we want amber flashing indicator lights instead of red flashing indicator lights. And America's like, oh, no, we're not going to do that. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me that America refuses to change its rules.
I hear you, and your point is well taken.
Hey, David, just really quickly along those same lines, and with the whole notion of cars, since we're on the topic of cars, a friend of mine gave me a lift because y'all know I get around by mass transit, and he noticed the price of gas had gone up and all along those lines. So is the tariff impacting those gas prices going up, and will we continue to see them going up? Because he did notice that as he was driving me those few miles to get from my job to my house and everything. But that was something he just happened to observe on several gas stations.
Well, I don't know about North Carolina, which is where you are, but they've actually come down somewhat in Virginia.
Toby, you had to stand up. That's good.
Well, actually, staying on the car thing, because Dave, I completely agree with you on the cars, because I love me some cars. And tech-wise, the American cars are built for muscle and strength, and that's what they've always been. And that's the calling card of the American car. Europeans, the Japanese cars and German cars. Well, German cars also have power because the Porsche, one of my favorite cars in the world. But in terms of the tech-wise, the Japanese and the Chinese cars have always actually led the way in that, because we've never actually put the tech in there. We've always put the engine in there. But speaking on that, that's why Tesla, when it first came out, or when they started really taking over the market globally, that's why people like the Tesla car, because not only was it small, but it also had some great tech in there. However, this is staying on that Tesla idea. China has their own car that is taking over the market, taking over globally, which is the BYD. That one is actually taken off. In terms of trucks, by the way, Rivian, which is an American car made out of California, that one actually is the best SUV style electric vehicle. But BYD, speaking on them, they have taken over the market globally from Tesla, and they have some amazing tech in there. BYD is barred from selling in the U.S. And my question to you, Dave, is because dealing with these tariff situations and the trade war with China, do you think, because BYD wants to come into the U.S. market because they know they can take over that market because their car is the actual BYD car is actually cheaper than the Tesla, but actually has a little bit better tech on the inside of it. And they've just created a minivan that is being released later this year, which is amazing. If you haven't checked it out, check out that BYD minivan. Phenomenal. Do you think the tariffs themselves, one, are protectionist to help Tesla in that light because they deal with the automobiles? Or do you think, do you think if we do resolve this trade war, could the BYD end up coming to the U.S. in an automobile trade-off?
Well, I think it's possible. The fact is that we have to make sure that we're credible. If we say that we want to eliminate non-tariff trade barriers, if we want reciprocity with regard to actual tariffs, that's a two-way street. We're very concerned because we don't have access to the Chinese market with regard to a number of things. We're very concerned that the Chinese steal IP regularly, if you will. At the same point in time, you're talking about EVs. China now produces 67% of all EVs, and so I think hopefully this thing will get resolved where we will have real reciprocity and real equity, and that means that some of the current players might not benefit from what that change is.
If I can just make a comment about tech, we have a well-known company here called Holden, which manufactures Australian-made vehicles. They don't anymore. General Motors bought them, and then to the dismay of Australians, they actually closed down the Holden. But what was really interesting was that the tech in the Holdens was fantastic. It was on par with the European cars that were coming in, BMWs, Mercedes, etc. One of my trips to the United States 6 or 7 years ago, I drove through in a Cadillac, which I personally felt was very similar in its tech and the way it drove to what I'd find in a BMW or a Mercedes. So I don't think it's something that the United States can't do, and I don't subscribe to the view that Germany is better at producing those things than the United States. I think the United States can do it, but it just needs a little bit of leadership, and I think perhaps a little bit of government pressure on some of the car manufacturers would be positive. But again, I think if the United States wants to fix its trade deficits, it has to produce things that the rest of the world wants. And the rest of the world actually tells America what they want. And so all America has to do is go, hey, you want this? Okay, we'll make it for you. Because the alternative is that those countries go elsewhere.
Well, I remember when I was younger, in my mid-30s, I was sent by the American Council of Young Political Leaders on several international trips. One of which was to Japan, where we met with the Prime Minister, a number of cabinet officials, the head of Toyota, the head of Seiko, the head of Keidan Ren, which is basically their Chamber of Commerce, if you will, several of their governors. But we also had an opportunity to spend the night in some Japanese homes. And it was very, very evident to me that given the size of their homes, given the width of their streets, that the Americans were totally out of touch with regard to what kind of products would be attractive to the Japanese. And it comes back, Shaquille, to what you said, right? You need to be sensitive to differences in different countries, and you need to be able to adapt your product and services to recognize those differences if you want to have any decent market share with regard to what your products are or what your services are.
David, what about the financial calculus that we're seeing that doesn't seem to me to add up? Number one, the U.S. Congress wants to decrease taxes, which means less revenue, which means a bigger deficit. Then number two, we have China come along and we slapped our creditor in the face, which normally you don't do. But let's assume that they decide they want to pull the debt. In other words, they're basically not purchase U.S. debt. those combinations will drive up interest on the debt. When the interest rate is, and already interest on the debt's the number one budget item, now it becomes a super budget item. Doesn't that have the possibility of this financial calculus, which looks like we're heading, throwing the United States into a major recession by increasing the debt, increasing the deficit, because China decides to pull out, and all of a sudden your biggest banker just decided not to lend you any more money?
Well, remember what I said, the two biggest concerns that I have. The two biggest concerns I have is how do we resolve this tariff issue? And secondly, how do we resolve our fiscal challenge, which is what you're talking about. The largest line item in the federal government's budget is Social Security. The second largest line item is interest, and it's the fastest growing line item. And what do we get for interest? Nothing. So I am very concerned. You know, the Congress, with regard to revenues, are talking about doing two things: extending all of the Trump tax cuts from 2017, and providing new tax cuts in connection with tips, overtime, and Social Security benefits. As you've heard me say many times, not all tax cuts stimulate the economy. Very few tax cuts pay for themselves. You combine that with the Senate's budget proposal, where they're committing to cut spending at least $5 billion over 10 years. Yes, you heard that right. $5 billion over 10 years. That's chump change, okay? But even the House bill, which wants to do 1.5 trillion over 10 years, well, divide that by 10, that's 150 billion a year, and we're running a deficit of 2 trillion a year. So that's nothing to smile about either. These people need to get serious. And you've heard me say before, what we need a fiscal sustainability commission where everything's on the table, but not everything's equal. By that, I mean mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and revenues, okay? And we need a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can take on, which will force elected officials to make tough choices on a recurring basis and cease mortgaging the future of our country, our children, grandchildren, and future generations. And I'm fighting and continue to fight for that and more.
You know that if there was a constitutional amendment, as you've proposed, that Congress, whether it be controlled by Republicans or Democrats, are going to hit that max and then stay there forever. There's no doubt about that. But you're right; it would probably stop them from increasing the amount they're spending. And America certainly does need to get its spending under control and get its deficits under control, because it's it is really, really problematic, and it's destabilizing to all of the other countries, which are the natural allies of the United States. Sort of make a very quick point. A handful of minutes ago, President Trump announced that all the flags will be at half-mast today because of the passing of the Pope. So don't know if you guys are aware of that or not.
Yeah, I'm Roman Catholic, a practicing Roman Catholic, and
Yeah, well, my condolences to you for the loss of the Pope. I said that in the previous show as well to our Catholic friends.
Yeah, thank you. Well, may you rest in peace with God. I'm also president of my neighborhood, among other things, and we lowered our flag, our neighborhood flag, to half staff as well. So, yeah.
I'm lighting a candle today in memory of him. Francis was great. He fought for human rights and humanity. I think he was very powerful in institutionalizing human rights that didn't exist before. He had a big, passionate and compassionate heart. I just think everything that he established for humanity, I pray that it holds. And, he was very upset with what was going on with America and not happy with the way things were being, people were being treated. So I pray that he is having a good conversation with God right now, and I'm sure he is.
He was controversial in the church, and
yes, he was.
You're correct. You're correct to say it'll be interesting to see who the next pope is, and whether or not they're going to be a progressive, which many would argue Francis was, or whether they're going to be more conservative, which Benedict was. Personally, my favorite pope has been and remains John Paul II.
Everybody loved John Paul. He seemed to be able to handle controversial issues very well. I don't know how he managed that so well, but yeah, as we know, it's not just who they pick, but it's also about the smoke, right? So,
Well,
I was born Catholic, so
Yeah.
and raised Catholic. So
I converted from being a Methodist to being a Roman Catholic when John Paul II was Pope. And I wear, and I do not take it off, a cross that he blessed in an audience that I was fortunate to have with him.
wow.
Yeah.
Hey,
We
David,
wasn't a private audience, okay?
I-
Well,
I-
Hey, David, just along those
I
lines.
had a
David,
similar experience with
Yeah.
when one of the bishops was canonized in San Francisco, and I still have the little gift he gave me when that happened. So I get goosebumps thinking about it. Yeah.
Hey, David, just along those lines and everything, just really quickly, because I'm not Catholic, but I did go to a Jesuit university and have friends that are big believers in liberation theology, which is definitely one of the more progressive versions of Catholicism and just religion in general. But I'm just curious, and I know it's getting away from economics. Do you think that there will be a push to have somebody from a particular region? Because I've heard people speculating about Asia and Africa as being where the next pope may come from. But I just wanted your take on that as a practicing Catholic.
well, as you know, Francis was the first Jesuit
Yes.
pope. Okay.
Yes.
He was also the first pope from the Western Hemisphere.
Yes.
He was also the first pope from Latin America. And I think, but something I found out that I didn't know about Pope Francis is his parents were Italian immigrants to Argentina,
Well,
which means that he did have Italian roots,
Mhm.
which obviously helped him because most popes up until recent years have been Italian. And I think there is a desire to try to provide more geographic diversity. The church is growing in Asia. The church is growing in Africa. The church is growing somewhat in South America. And so I think, that's something I'm sure that will be on people's minds. But we'll just have to wait and see.
There
I
was
want
a report
to
that
add
came out in
something about
Australia
the
a few days
financial
ago.
impact is Catholic Church is probably one of the largest, and we know this, churches, but they get the most money in the world. And they've turned it around and they invest in startups in a faith foundation program. And probably they invest the most, many, many millions of dollars goes back into startup programs that benefit society, right? So, keep an eye on that as well. But they are very economically sound. I think they try to make the communities, the world, the country economically sound. I think, we don't give them enough credit for doing that. And, it is going to be interesting to see who they put in place of Francis. So.
There was a report that came out a few days ago here in Australia that across all denominations, there's actually been an uptick in church attendance. And most interestingly, there was a significant increase across the Western world in church attendance by young people, as in the Gen Zs and the younger millennials. So I found that quite interesting. I think the church went through a somewhat benighted time about a decade or so ago, but I think its reputation is beginning to come back, and I think people are looking for that, for that connection to God and some structure to their lives. So I hope that they pick a good pope that will be a great leader.
Shaquille, to that point and everything along those lines, it is the plug for one of our other shows, Dropping Pearls with Mama G, which is one of our newer shows, and she is of a religious background. That's actually what the topic was, because she has Thomas, who is a fellow minister. So they're both ministers in the church and everything. I think one is more independent than the other in terms of church affiliations. But that's actually something today we're talking about was what you just said, Shaquille, which is that church membership is going up instead of going down. So it is definitely a sign that more people are wanting to turn back to faith and all along those lines. So that's something that they talked about yesterday on her show, which airs Sundays on the network at 7:00.
And I've heard the same thing. And as you all know, I'm an usher, a lead usher at my Catholic parish, and my wife sings in the choir. And of course, yesterday was, the holiest day of the year for Catholics, Easter Sunday. And of course, you're going to have overwhelming attendance on Easter Sunday. We have some people who we call CEOs, Christmas and Easter only.
Yeah.
The number one religion in the United States is Roman Catholic. The number two religion in the United States is former Roman Catholic.
In fact, I have friends now, and they say those are the only 2 days they really don't want to go to church anymore because it's so crowded. They can't get to the parking lot because it's just too crowded. So I had a few friends over yesterday, and they kind of skipped church because, on that morning, they go all the other times. So
It can get too crowded, that's for sure. And there's David knows everybody will come out in their, for lack of a better term, Easter fineries on that particular day. So you will see some folks that might not have the best dresses on any other day, but on Easter Sunday they come out in some of their Easter best outfits.
and hats.
I since we're doing plugs, Mark, I'll do a plug for the Lawyers Den tomorrow at 6 o'clock. We're having the lead attorney who filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration for declaring, basically he's saying that the tariffs are illegal and the tariffs should be manufactured by Congress. It's a legislative, not an executive function. Since he filed the suit in the U.S. Court of International Trade, another lawsuit was filed in California by our friend Gavin Newsom using the same legal theory, and another one in Florida has been filed. So there are 3 suits. It's a very interesting constitutional issue that Congress is the one that needs to take leadership in tariffs, not the executive branch.
We'll see how Pam Bondi responds to that Florida.
I don't know. We're actually the lead attorney is with a liberation group in Washington, D.C. He's going to be on our show tomorrow night at 6 o'clock to explain the legal theory behind Trump doesn't have the power to impose any tariffs.
Correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Lindsey Graham in an interview say something like that he shouldn't technically have done it, but Congress won't do anything about it because it's all controlled by the Republicans? Didn't Lindsey Graham say something on those lines recently?
I don't know. I'd like to hear David's point on it, but we're going to have the attorney who drafted the suit in tomorrow at 6 o'clock.
Let me jump in on that, okay?
Sure.
Because one of the persons who's a friend of mine from Mass is a long-standing Senate staffer, very senior Senate staffer. And while under the Constitution, the Congress is the lead with regard to tariff matters, the Congress has passed 3 pieces of legislation over many years that delegate certain authority to the president with regard to tariffs. And so the real question is what the president doing consistent with the scope of authority provided by those 3 pieces of legislation? If they are, then he's okay. If they're not, then he's not. And as you know, he tries to stretch the envelope. I mean, he's done several things, that he's tried to do via executive order, like birthright citizenship, which he clearly can't do through executive order. Okay, and so we'll see. But it's not as clear as some people would assert it. It's all a matter of whether or not it's within the scope of the authorities that have been delegated to the president, including whether or not this is deemed to be an emergency.
Yeah. Well, I can send an invite for the panel discussion tomorrow, David, at 6 o'clock. It's got to be an interesting case. I read through the complaint. They haven't filed an answer yet, and I'm just looking at how you can defend it is going to be very interesting. And of course, on May the 5th, we do have the Supreme Court who's going to have the hearing relating to birthright citizenship. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court is closed. You can't just go in and talk to these people. It doesn't work that way. But I might get a interview with one of the attorneys that are handling the case on that particular issue. With that, our case is over with because we're at the hour. We wanted to thank the the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, our viewers in the United States, and of course, around the world. And we'll see you next week on Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.